Most of us are totally unaware of what actually goes on in the teaching environment of today's classroom. Our guest today spent 17 years as a science teacher in state schools in England and Wales, similar to the public schools in the U.S. He uses this experience to bring to light the secular way of thinking that is so pervasive in our public schools. Coming up next on today's edition of Origins, Truth, Lies, and Science Education, Part 2 with Paul Taylor. Hello, my friends, and welcome to Origins. My name is Donn Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host. During this program, we showcase interesting guests who present evidence from science along with other important facts to validate the truth of creation and the accuracy of the Bible. Today's guest, Paul Taylor, graduated with a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from the University of Nottingham and later obtained his master's degree from the University of Cardiff. He is also a website programmer and a former high school science teacher. He's been speaking and writing on the subject of creation around the world for more than 35 years. Paul, how wonderful it is to have you with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we're talking about truth, lies, and science education. You're not implying there's any lies in science education, are you?
In actual fact, I don't want to be too down on this because there aren't deliberate lies, but you know, in my book on the same title, I do show that there are some errors that have crept in, mostly because people are coming from things from a different worldview.
There's a whole perspective that's being supported there, isn't there?
Yes. I mean, the educationalist Mark Roke says that science, whether it's chemistry, physics, or biology, is always interpreted in the light of a person's worldview. Exactly. The idea that any scientific evidence is neutral is nonsense. Evidence makes no sense whatsoever unless it's interpreted in the light of a worldview. And to pretend otherwise is disingenuous.
So, you're going to help us today if we have one worldview and our science teacher, our kid's science teacher in school has another.
That's right. And we need to sort of analyze where this worldview has come in. So, for this particular slide is taken from the Florida State Science Education document. And it says here, according to fossil records, the horses that lived 50 million years ago were much smaller, weaker, and slower than modern horses. And then they're being asked here, which process is most likely responsible for the changes that have led to the increased size, strength, and speed in horses? And clearly, students are being directed towards the last answer there, right. Evolution by natural selection. And this is not, in fact, the case. They assume that horses have got bigger and bigger and bigger to modern-day horses, whereas, in fact, we find that modern-day horses are a huge variety of sizes. And so the whole schema that they've developed doesn't make sense.
So I have to ask you, former science teacher, if a young man put B down as an answer, could you mark it wrong?
B would have to be marked wrong, yes. And now, if I was teaching this, I would have to preface it to a class by saying this is within the evolutionary theory. Right. And we would need as a class to discuss that there are other theories, right, and that there are problems with this. It would be not correct not to do so, but it wouldn't be scientifically accurate to do so. But this is clearly directing the students to a particular answer.
It certainly is.
Yeah. Now, you see, these similarities that you see might be taught, and we can have a look at them in other ways. If people are saying that similarities suggest evolution, then maybe it might be interesting for the students to look at these two animals. You know, clearly the one on the left is a wolf. So we are all happy with the idea that wolves have developed into modern-day dogs and coyotes and so on. They're within the wolf kind, the dog kind. All modern domestic dogs would come from that kind. But look at this creature here, the Thylacine, often referred to as a Tasmanian wolf, Now, these are extinct. It's interesting, if you go on YouTube, you'll be able to find videos of the last remaining one of these. Structurally, it looks very similar to the wolf. So by all the processes which the children have been taught about evolution, you ought to assume that these two animals have a common ancestor. But they don't.
Oh.
And evolutionists do not believe they do, because these have they would say, we don't agree with this, but they would say that these have a common ancestor with kangaroos, because they are marsupials. And so this is the sort of thing that we get. So even their own criteria do not actually make a lot of sense.
No.
Now, another example here from the Florida State Education is looking at embryos. So the diagram here is illustrating the embryonic stage of two organisms. This is what is being taught then in high school biology. So you've got these two embryos, bird and reptile. Which of the following can be determined by observing the embryos shown in the diagram? These sort of multiple choice questions are clearly directing the students towards one answer. So they're not being able to answer this in an open-minded way and discuss what they think is right. This is a closed question, and clearly at least two of these will be nonsensical. And in fact, of course, the answer that they are being directed to, as we probably can guess, is A. They're being directed to A, right, that the organisms share a common ancestry. Now, this is a well-known feature of evolutionary teaching. For example, on the Oregon State Education document, says that students need to be able to communicate scientific information, that common ancestry and biological evolution are supported by multiple lines of empirical evidence. Now, I would dispute that. There isn't empirical evidence that supports biological evolution, but let's see what example they're giving, because they go on to clarify and say the emphasis is on a conceptual understanding of the role each line of evidence has relating to common ancestry and biological evolution. Examples of evidence could include similarities in DNA sequences, anatomical structures, and the order of appearance of structures in embryological development. Now, this is really referring to what's known as Haeckel's embryos.
Right.
The idea that embryos in all living creatures are supposed to go through similar stages of evolution, showing a common ancestry. Do you know that this particular idea was shown to be false in the 1950s?
And yet we still print it.
Exactly. No serious evolutionary professor in a university teaches this, but high schools still do.
And why is that?
Because in many cases, the science teachers in schools are not up to date with the latest science. I discovered that when I was a high school science teacher. The teachers have got a lot of work to do on trying to keep up with the exam systems, government documents, collecting homeworks, marking them. They don't usually spend a great deal of time researching science.
I think I'm a little more skeptical than you. I think it still ends up in the books because it's a part of the indoctrination.
Yes.
And it's not part of sharing truth.
It's a convenient way of trying to explain things.
Yes.
And here's a convenient way of trying to explain DNA, for example. Now, most people know that DNA is a language, and it follows the rules of language. So an example that you can find on the Florida website is this one, that if you started with a sentence like, the fat cat ate the rat, then maybe over a period of time there could be random changes. For example, if this was being used in the telephone game, then you would get random changes. So maybe on the third line there, it changes to saying, the fat car ate the rat. And the science teacher who illustrates this, and he's actually voicing this over on the Florida website, says that this is an example of change of information. So you can see then that you change again here at this line, the fat car ate the bat, and finally the far car ate the bat. But is that really information? Because this last one doesn't make sense. Cars don't eat bats, whether they're far away or nearby. In other words, you have lost information. This cannot actually be the way that DNA works, and it can't be a method for gaining information. And I remember seeing a children's television program back in Britain, presented by Richard Dawkins, where he passed around a bag of Scrabble letters. Each child had to pick a letter, and eventually 3 of them picked successively the letter C-A-T. And he said, C-A-T, a word. We get information randomly, but you do not, because that word only means something if you happen to know English.
Right.
And if it's in another language, it would make no sense. Another alphabet, it would make no sense whatsoever. So language is needed for interpretation. Cars don't eat bats and they don't get fat. And this is what leads to this nonsense. You know, suppose you made these sort of changes, you'd have complete nonsensical information. It makes no sense whatsoever. So this is where you get these common ideas that we share 96% of DNA with a chimp. Therefore, we're supposed to have a common ancestor with a chimp. Now, I'm not going to go into whether we do share 96% or not. I'm just going to say that doesn't prove common ancestry. Because even if it were true, it could easily be explained by common design.
Absolutely.
And after all, we do share 92% of DNA with a pig, or for that matter, 60% of DNA with a banana. Children should be taught that as well. Now, the Washington state education system says in this second clause here that we'll concentrate on that evidence uncovered by various methods reveals a planet that had no oxygen in its atmosphere until the evolution of life 3.5 billion years ago. Well, what evidence are they actually looking for? Here's a high school textbook that says that the planet started off being molten and eventually volcanic activity produced oceans that eventually produced life in the oceans that eventually crawled out onto the land. And they finish at the bottom of the page by saying all the elements needed to evolve into simple cells were there. Well, how do they know those elements were there? Because of this famous experiment known as the Miller-Urey experiment, where they heated up water, so you get water vapor being heated up, and then once that water vapor has been heated up, it's passed into a reaction chamber where methane, ammonia, and hydrogen are put. The mixture is cooled down, and then the reactants actually extracted. And the point is they get amino acids here. So where do those amino acids come from? And we're told that those amino acids are the building blocks of life. But the point is there is no elemental oxygen in there. Why is there no elemental oxygen in there? Simply because they know that if there was any elemental oxygen in there, it would immediately smash up the amino acids. So this is actually a circular argument. They've chosen those gases to produce the effects that they want.
Right.
In fact, it gets worse because those amino acids actually are asymmetric. Now, it's a bit technical, this, so I don't want to go into too much technical stuff, but basically you get two mirror images of the molecules. And this experiment will produce a half and half mixture, 50% mixture, as you would expect. But living things only contain what's called the left-handed version. Now, this experiment does not explain how you only get the left-handed version. And there are lots of other problems with this. Loads of problems. But you see, even if it had worked, even if a little creature had jumped out of the flask at the end and said, "Hi there, I think, therefore I am," that would not prove that this experiment produced life randomly, because the experiment is very intelligently designed.
Right. Intelligently designed.
Here's a physics question. What's meant by redshift? What's meant by a light year? I'm not answering those questions at the moment. I want to show you how the questions are used. So, for example, in this science textbook, here's a question saying a galaxy is 1,200 million light years away from us. It's moving away from us at 30,000 kilometers per second. That's 1/10 the speed of light. Assuming its speed has been constant, it's saying, how long is it taking for this galaxy and us to be far apart? Now, I know you want to tell me the answer straight away. The answer, of course, is 1.2 billion years.
It was on the tip of my tongue.
Yeah, I realise that. But this is the important question, not the math. This is the important bit. What's the significance of that value? Well, the significance of that value is they're told that that's the age of the universe. And how do they know that? Because they were told that in the previous page in the textbook. So you see, this is not an open-ended question. They're being given the answer and they're being led that way. And by the way, though that was the answer at that particular stage, all that time ago, it isn't the answer that we would give today. Today's textbooks say that the universe is 13.7 billion years ago. This textbook comes from the year 2000. So in the last 15 years, the universe has got 1.7 billion years older.
And that's not because the redshift is moving faster.
No, it isn't. So the important point I want to say on this, and I could give you loads and loads of other examples,
Sure.
but I won't. I'll finish with this example. The point that I'm making is that the examples are not open-ended. Pupils are being guided towards a point because it is not simply education. There is a moral aspect behind this. There is a worldview that is being portrayed behind what seems to be innocent, open-ended science.
So sometimes what looks like education is really indoctrination.
Absolutely right. And that's the point that I think we need to bring across here.
We want to talk about the implications of that, but we have to take a break. So you stay there, and we'll be right back. We are back to Origins, and we're talking to Paul Taylor about truth, lies, and science education. Paul, when we left, you were making the point that a lot of science books are kind of set the student up. They kind of guide them to the answer they want them to have rather than really looking for the truth.
Yes, and I think that's a shame because what we read at another time in another show from a Washington State document was that science is actually about developing hypotheses and then criticizing them, bringing them down. And I want to show students that they should be able to challenge the assumptions behind a lot of this science.
That's what science is. And,
Absolutely.
you know, one of the things, it takes the truth out of our textbooks. It also takes the excitement out of science.
Yes.
That there should be a discovery where we're honestly looking together for something new, something exciting, something true.
Yes.
And it's a shame we've lost that.
It is, and I think sometimes we're out of the sciences, we're the most critical of biology because biology is the one that seems to oversimplify things for students and give them these facts that we know are not facts, but are basically untruths that they have to sort of learn and use. But it's not the only area of science. I've got a further example here, for example, which is from physics.
Yeah.
And, you know, maybe people need to understand this. It's to do with radiometric dating, how you date the age of a rock. And here's a high school textbook. This is an English high school textbook, but I've seen similar things in American textbooks too. So it says in the example, there's a rock sample, and the proportion of uranium-238 atoms to lead-206 atoms was found to be 4:1. So the question is, how old is the rock? What they're saying then is that using this diagram, then on average for every 5 atoms of uranium-238 when the rock was formed, 1 atom has decayed and 4 atoms have not decayed yet. And that is immediately the thing that the students should challenge. In other words, how do we know that point? So from the graph, they're saying, well, 80% is uranium-238. So you can see from the graph it cuts at 1,500 million years. Therefore, the rock is 1,500 million years old. So let's just show the things that the students should have been able to challenge. First of all, there are 3 assumptions that this question has made. First assumption is that the half-life of uranium has remained constant, that it has always been the same rate throughout the supposed millions of years that that rock has been there. Now, without going into complex stuff, there are a lot of scientists who have shown that half-lives actually vary. They are not constant. And it's very likely that the half-life of uranium changed considerably in the past. Secondly, a more easy one to understand is that the question assumes that when the rock originally formed, there was no lead in it. How do they know?
Yeah.
You know, I always use an example where I say, what if I had an hourglass here on the desk? You measure the amount of sand in the top, measure the amount of sand in the bottom, measure how fast the sand's going through. You can calculate how long that hourglass has been going, can't you?
Yeah.
No, you can't, because you don't know that all the sand was in the top when I put it there.
Oh.
And that's the point. How do we know that there was no lead in that rock when the rock was formed? We don't have Doctor Who's TARDIS to go back and find out. And thirdly, and finally, that all the time that that rock has been sat there, that no lead has either been washed into the rock or washed out. And I use the word washed because lead compounds are pretty soluble in water. So it defies logic to suppose that for millions of years that rock has been there with no water washing it in or washing it away.
You know, you bring a healthy skepticism that really is what makes science work, isn't it?
Yes.
You have to ask those kind of questions.
I used to train my students to be skeptical. Yeah. And I remember the very first time as a young teacher that I introduced the theory of evolution to them. I'd brought this skepticism to them, and they'd had me for 3 years, and in the 3rd year, I introduced the theory of evolution to them. Do you know, they all fell about laughing. Huh. Scientists don't really believe that, do they? I said, look, I'm afraid they do. Some of my colleagues do. Please don't offend them too much. But yes, I agree with you. It's laughable. And when they've been introduced in that way with that skepticism, they saw the point.
Yes, that's wonderful.
But, you know, I want to bring this back to what our responsibility is here, because I want to show you how I think this happened and give you a practical example of what we can do about it. You see, a couple of 100 years ago, Western society used to be based on the idea that the Bible was true. And therefore, it might not have had the last word on everything to do with science. People tell me the Bible is not a science textbook. That's a good thing, by the way. Science textbooks change every year. The Bible does not. But where the Bible touches on science, it spoke the truth. So we have a framework here so that when the Bible talks about anthropology, it speaks the truth. About geology, about biology, about astronomy, it speaks the truth. But what's happened is that the church sort of separated itself from those things. The church gradually gave up on all those things. First of all, the church gave up on the Bible's biology, accepting the theory of evolution. The church gave up on the Bible's geology. Actually, it gave up on geology before biology. I'm sorry, it gave up on that and accepted millions and millions of years with theories like the gap theory and day-age theory and so on. Then the church gave up on the Bible's astronomy. And the church gave up on the Bible's anthropology, actually then adding that the human beings had evolved as well as other animals. So now the church has nothing to say about the world. It's got no involvement in that framework. And that's really what I think has come about. It's a really dangerous situation that we've got ourselves in. We've got to reclaim it because our children are coming to our churches in Sunday schools and they're not being taught real facts. And I think there are practical ways forward where we can actually put this right. And I want to suggest a practical alternative, which might be the sort of thing you might want to do around your dinner table, because we're told, aren't we, in Deuteronomy, that we should be talking about these things to our children as we walk with them, as we eat with them, and so on. And it's what's called the Trinity curriculum model. It was developed by Steve Thomas and David Freeman. And it's a Trinity model because it involves 3 things: source, means, and fulfillment. So let me give you an example. Supposing we wanted to teach our children, or we knew that our children at school were learning about the water cycle. Okay. So the water cycle is clearly the fact that you've got evaporation of the oceans, so you're getting condensation, you're getting rain that's falling on the land, the water is going back to the sea again. Now, I love the water cycle, and the water cycle is mentioned in Scripture in Ecclesiastes chapter 1. It talks about it there. You've got a very good illustration of the water cycle. So this is something that children need to be taught about. But first of all, maybe we should be telling them that there is a source concept that they need to learn. And this source concept is that God is Jehovah Jireh. He provides all that's needed for creation. All the water that's needed for creation is provided by God. There's a heart concept that I think children should know here. A seed truth of wisdom expressed in one sentence. We need to find that for everything we teach them. And this is the seed concept for this topic, that the water cycle reveals God's wise and economic provision. And that should be the first thing, the source of the topic. Then we come to the second thing, which is the means. And this is the traditional teaching. This is your facts. This is where you demonstrate the water cycle to the students. This is where we give questions to check that they understand it. So this second section is what you think of as the traditional teaching. But then the third section is the fulfillment. So having gone through this, has the student understood what this means about God? And we discuss this to see if they can understand the implications behind the water cycle and behind that heart concept. And I think, even if your children are in public schools, this is the sort of thing that you can be framing the topics in the home situation around the dinner table once they've learnt these things.
That's excellent. So really in the middle is the teaching.
Yes.
But first we're putting it in context of God, and secondly making the application.
That's right. And I think we just need to frame the things that children are learning, particularly in science, in that way. It might be useful to sort of close off here with a quote from Martin Luther, because Martin Luther had something to say about education. He said this. He said, "I would advise no one to send his child where the Holy Scriptures are not supreme." He said, "I greatly fear that the universities, unless they teach the Holy Scriptures diligently and impress them on the young students, are wide gates to hell." You know, and if we're not addressing this education of our next generation, then this is the problem that we're going to have. We're going to leave them in this state. According to Hebrews 11, faith is substantial, and faith actually is the evidence of things not seen. I don't need evidence to back up my faith. My faith is the evidence.
Amen. You've given us a lot to think about today, Paul, and especially I think this is important for our parents who still have kids at home. And I just want to reemphasize that you keep talking about getting around the dinner table together and discussing what they're learning. As a grandparent, I look back on the days when my kids were young and I thought they would never end, but they go by pretty quickly.
Yes, they do.
And if you aren't intentional in those years, there's going to be years of regret later.
Amen. That's absolutely right.
So thank you for this good teaching, but also the caution and the warning that's in there to be parents who are really engaged, because this is the time that matters.
It is indeed.
Thank you so much. Friends, I hope you've heard the message that Paul has brought us today, the clear scientific evidence, but also the spiritual insight behind it. And never forget this, my friend, it's God's view that He created you. That should be your worldview too. Join us again soon here on Origins. Until then, God bless you, my friend.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file from our website at originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, you can order online or send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program, number 1606, Cornerstone Network, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and financial support of you, our Cornerstone family.